Okay, so this is the second lecture on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2, which focuses on the virtues, and I promise this lecture will not be quite as long as the previous one. So if you remember what we saw in the previous lecture, a virtue account consists of three elements. First, a conception of what the function, purpose, or end, or in Greek, the telos of something is. The function or the purpose of cycling, being a student, living in community, and so forth, and human life as a whole is going to be kind of the key question here. And a conception of a good cyclist, student, citizen, human, or whatever, as one that does this well, lives it out, fulfills it, and fulfills it well. And the virtues as those things that something needs to perform its function well. And so we can talk about the virtues that you would need to be a good student. We can talk about the virtues that somebody would need to be a successful athlete, like a cyclist or a running back. We can talk about the virtues that we need to live in community and to be good citizens, and so forth. We can talk about the virtues needed to be a good soldier, or airman, or seaman. Or the virtues needed to be a good mother, or father, or co-worker. And again, all this is built on some conception of what it is that you do. What it is that you do as a father, or a soldier, or a cyclist, or a student, and so forth. And so when we're talking about human life as a whole, we say, what is it that humans as a whole do? What's distinctive about us? What is it that makes us human? And Aristotle's answer was, we think, we reason, we rationalize, we deliberate, we have consciousness, we have self-awareness, and those kinds of things. And so a good human life is going to be one that exhibits these qualities and does it well. And when we talk about a good human life, we're talking about happiness. We're talking about what it means to be genuinely happy. But to live this out, to fulfill this, we need the virtues. We need certain characteristics or qualities in order to live well as human beings. And so I want to just start off by looking at Aristotle's definition of what a virtue is. A virtue is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, which is to say the mean relative to us, and this is determined by a rational principle, that principle by which the man or woman of practical wisdom would determine it. Now, as is often the case with definitions like this, sometimes it's a mouthful, sometimes it's hard to really understand what's going on here, so we'll look at this closely. And we'll start by looking at what it means to have a state of character. Now, when we're talking about a state of character, we're talking about something deeply rooted in us. And one word that we use for things like that is a habit. And Aristotle talks about the virtues as habits. Now, habits can be thought of as bad things. We sometimes will say, somebody has a habit of habitually lying, or a smoking habit, or an overeating habit, or something like that. Habits can also be very mundane things, like my son has a habit of talking with his mouth full, or some people have the habit of cracking their knuckles, or something along those lines. And of course there's good habits, things like the habit of brushing your teeth every night before you go to bed, or the habit of wearing your seatbelt in the car, or checking the mirrors before changing lanes, or things like that. And whatever we're talking about habits, we're talking about things that are acquired through repetition. You repeatedly put your seatbelt on, and you acquire the habit of putting your seatbelt on in the car. Once you acquire a habit, it's steady. It's not easily acquired, but it's not easily lost or changed either. And they strongly affect our behavior. This is especially the case when we think of bad habits, things that we wish we didn't do, but we can see how strongly they affect our behavior when we think about how hard it is to change them. But good habits are the same way. They strongly affect our behavior. We find it strange or weird or disconcerting if we're not checking our mirrors or putting on our seatbelts or brushing our teeth or something like that. And so a moral virtue, something like courage or generosity or benevolence or justice, is going to be it's going to be a similar sort of thing. It's going to be this state of character that we acquire through repetition of virtuous actions, of courageous things, of generous things, doing things over and over again. And eventually they become easy to us. They're steady. They're hard to acquire sometimes, but once we acquire them, they're also hard to change, and they strongly affect our behavior. As an example, think back to the discussions of our eating habits that we picked up on in week 2. A lot of people expressed dismay at the way the animals were treated, and they said, I wish I could do something about that, but I like eating meat too much, or I have a certain lifestyle that's too hard to change. And from an Aristotelian perspective, we would say that's understandable. You have a habit of eating food in a certain kind of way. And sometimes we recognize that these habits are not good and that we ought to have different kinds of habits. So to acquire the virtue of compassion and temperance would be hard to do, but it's possible to do. It's possible to do by repeating the kinds of actions somebody who was compassionate or intemperate would do, and eventually our character will change and we'll acquire the new habits, new virtues. So that's the idea here. Now the second feature of the virtues is that they lie in a mean between excess and defect. And both the excess and the defect are going to be vices. For example, let's look at courage. Now, this is where a lot of discussions of the virtues, including the way the text talks about the virtues, can be very misleading, because you might hear people say that you can have too much courage or too little courage. But that's, strictly speaking, not the case. Courage is going to be getting things right. Courage is the virtue. You can have too much of something, and it can be something different than courage, or too little of something, and it can be something different than courage, but you're never going to have too much or too little courage, because again, courage is having the right amount of this something. And perhaps we might call it fearlessness, for lack of a better word. The ability to approach a situation and either not experience fear or not let your experience of fear keep you from doing what you want to do. And having too little of that is pretty obvious. When you have too much fear, or when your fears control you too much and they keep you from doing what you ought to be doing, we call that cowardice. But you can also have too much of this kind of fearlessness. And we sometimes call this foolhardiness or rashness or recklessness. So in the written guidance, I give the example of a soldier who doesn't run out into the midst of danger to rescue his fellow soldier when that's kind of the brave, the appropriate thing to do. And that would be a coward when he doesn't have the courage to do that. But when somebody runs out into danger when there's no real need and there's no real good reason to do so, then he probably isn't being cautious enough. And we call this foolhardy or rash or reckless. And so these two extremes are both going to be opposed to the virtue of courage. And also in the written guidance, I talk about temperance. And temperance is a virtue having to do with our bodily appetites, and most discussions of it concern sexual appetites and our eating habits, our desires for food and drink and so forth. And here again, we can have too much of these desires, too much of these appetites, and the indulgence of these appetites. And we call this gluttony, eating too much or drinking too much. We call it drunkenness. Having too much of an appetite for sexual activity, we call this lustfulness or something like that. Right? So when somebody doesn't feel the desires and act on the desires in the appropriate way and indulges them too much, that's a vice, and we have certain words for it. But we can also say that there's too little of these appetites, and this is something that's a little less common to talk about. In Aristotle, even in the Greek, there's no proper term for it, and I don't think we really have much of a term for it in English. Sometimes some people say insensitivity, but we can say that when people aren't eating the right way, when they don't have the right kinds of appetites for the right kinds of food, then there's too little of a certain kind of appetite, and that can be very unhealthy. And in a marriage, for instance, they talk about the importance of sexual intimacy. And if you don't have the appetite for that, if you don't have the desire for sexual intimacy with your spouse, then something can be missing that's important from a marriage. And of course, lots of discussions can be continued over what exactly these kinds of things mean, but I wanted to just give you a feel for it. Now, Aristotle says that the virtues don't just lie in a mean between excess and defect. They lie in a mean relative to us. And this is where things get kind of tricky. This is where we realize that it's one thing to talk about the virtues being in the intermediate state between excess and defect. It's another thing to say what exactly that means. And it's another reason to be suspicious of theories that try to encapsulate this in terms of certain hard and fast rules or principles or something like that. Because basically what we're going to have in order to discern what the real mean or intermediate is practical wisdom. Wisdom to understand what the right amount at the right time really is. And this is not something you can always spell out ahead of time in a way that's the same for every person in every situation. Rather, the mean is relative to the person and to the situation. Now, I want to emphasize that relative, in this context, relative does not mean anything goes. Whatever you happen to think, whatever you happen to believe. That's not what Aristotle means by relative in this situation. There is a truth to what the mean is. There is a truth to what's the right amount. It just varies depending upon the situation. And I'll give you some examples to help see what that means. If you read through the guidance, you will have seen this example already, but I'll repeat it and talk you through it. Consider this diet. Somebody who eats these things every single day. 12,000 calories. Chocolate chip pancakes, mayonnaise, pizza. Right? This is not exactly the kind of diet that most of us would consider to be healthy. And indeed, for most people, if they ate this sort of diet, they would probably end up looking like this, or maybe not quite so bad, but something similar. However, this diet can be perfectly appropriate for somebody who looks like that. That diet plan was what Michael Phelps was eating every single day as he was winning all those gold medals that he won a few years back in the Olympics. And it brings us back to what we were talking about before regarding the dependency of our conception of the virtues on some conception of what the point of the virtues is, what they enable, where they lead us to. And if you're an Olympic swimmer, then the virtue of temperance, eating the right amount in the right way at the right time, is going to look a certain way. However, if you're a normal person like you and I, the virtue of temperance is going to look very different because we have different ends, we have different purposes, right? And we're not aiming to win gold medals, and we're not conditioned in certain ways. And so what the right amount of food in the right way at the right time is for us is going to be very, very different than it is for Michael Phelps. And that's not to say there isn't truth to the matter. What is good for Michael Phelps is good because it enables him to fulfill his purpose. That's true. That's a fact. And likewise, it's a fact that if we ate that same diet, we would be morbidly obese. That's also true. And so what constitutes temperance is going to vary depending upon the person and depending upon the situation, but it's still going to be a truth as to what in that situation for that person really is the right amount. And to be able to discern what that right amount is, we have to have a certain degree of wisdom, practical wisdom. What in Greek they call phronesis. And it's the wisdom that enables you to perceive a situation and to perceive certain features of that situation as giving you a reason to act in a certain way. For example, if you're a soldier and you have the virtue of courage, you might be out in a particularly dangerous situation, and your fellow soldier is in danger. And you see your fellow soldier in danger as providing you a reason to act, a reason to go try to rescue him, a reason to go put your life on the line in order to try to save his life. And you say that the fact that my fellow soldier is out there in danger, that's a reason for me to go out there and try to rescue him. But if you lack that virtue, if you're a coward, if you have the vice of cowardliness, you wouldn't see the fact that his life is out there in danger as providing you a reason for action. You would probably focus more on the fact that your own life would be in danger, and you'd see that as a reason not to go out there. So having the virtue of courage gives you the wisdom to understand that in this sort of situation, the fact that one of your fellow soldiers is in danger is indeed a reason to go out there and put your life on the line for his sake. Whereas if you didn't really have a good reason to go put your life on the line, and you went out there and put yourself in danger anyway, we talked about that as being rashness or recklessness or something like that. And somebody of practical wisdom would say, well, you know what, there's really no good reason for me to put my life on the line and to risk making my wife a widow or making my child fatherless or something like that. There's no good reason for me to do that. And that's the kind of wisdom that comes with having the virtue of courage. And that somebody with the vice of recklessness would not have. And finally, one very important point, Aristotle says that the virtues are not just about acting the right way, doing the right things at the right time. They're also about feeling the right way, feeling the right things at the right time. He says they involve both passions, or feelings, and actions. A virtue concerns one's whole being, one's whole character. And of course, our feelings are an important part of our lives. And so having our feelings rightly attuned to the situation is going to be very, very important. Especially since feelings have such a strong impact on how we actually do act. If I'm going to do the courageous thing that I ought to do, or if I'm going to refrain from indulging my appetites in ways that I shouldn't do, then certainly having certain feelings in the right order is going to be very, very important. And feelings can be a very, very important guide to what we ought to be doing. For example, in week 2, we had this video of factory farming. And a lot of people expressed during the discussions the feelings that they had when they were watching that. And we might say that having the appropriate feelings, the appropriate emotional reactions to depictions of violence and suffering like that's something very, very important. If we didn't feel a sense of sorrow or revulsion, then perhaps something is lacking in the virtue of compassion or sensitivity. But on the other hand, if one felt similar kinds of feelings at the sight of somebody being operated on in the emergency room and proceeded to rush in there and stop the doctor from cutting open the person who really needed this operation, then that would be an instance of one's passions being out of control. So again, it's going to depend upon the situation and what's called for at the particular time. Now, to kind of sum up these kinds of things, Aristotle says there's going to be three distinguishing features of virtuous action. One is that they're going to be done with knowledge. We know what we're doing. We're doing it because it's right. We're doing it because we have good reason to do it. We're not just doing it accidentally. We're going to be choosing the actions for their own sake, rationally. Michael Phelps is going to be choosing the diet he chooses, and we're going to be choosing a different diet. Rationally, we're going to be doing it because we know that this is the right thing to do. And the courageous person who goes and rescues his fellow soldier on the battlefield is going to be doing that because his soldier is in need and not because his soldier owes him $100 or something from a poker game the night before. So that's kind of what it means to be choosing the actions for their own sake. And we're going to be doing it from a firm and unchangeable character. If I'm a cold, selfish, greedy person who would never even look twice at somebody in need, and all of a sudden I feel this sort of twinge of guilt when I look at a homeless person begging for money, and I give him a few bucks or something like that and then go on my merry way and keep being the cold, heartless, selfish person that I normally am, that was a nice thing that I did, but that wasn't a virtuous action because it wasn't done from a firm and unchangeable character. And in short, the virtuous person does the right thing at the right time in the right way and for the right reason. So all four of those elements are going to be present in virtuous action. And Aristotle uses the image of the archer. He says that the virtuous person hits the mark. He gets it right. And if we think about the image of the archer, and we look at the image of a target, and we think about all the ways that when somebody shoots an arrow at the target, how many ways they can go wrong. And yet there is a certain kind of way of going right. That's kind of the way that Aristotle envisions virtuous action. We might do the right thing at the right time in the right way, but not for the right reasons, and so we're not going to quite hit the mark. Or we might have good intentions and good reasons, but not quite do the right thing, and so we're not going to hit the mark. And so the practical wisdom that the virtues support and that they give us is not something easy to acquire. It's not something that we easily come by. And that's why we have to think hard about it. That's why we have to talk about it with other people. That's why we have to study it. And that's why we have to continually strive to look for ways that we can become more virtuous people and try to build those habits that are characteristic of having the virtues. Aristotle identifies four virtues as being cardinal, the most important, the most salient, the most sort of dominant virtues: courage, temperance, justice, and practical wisdom. And there are, of course, many, many others that we can talk about. So here's a summary of what we've talked about, and I hope this gives you a sense of what Aristotle was trying to communicate through this discussion, and gives you a lot of things to think about as you try to evaluate and assess his point of view, especially relative to the other theories that we've considered.